breakfast-like assembly, we all shouted and so on. So if my volume starts squeaking and screaming or whatever, just wave and I'll try and modulate my voice to a whisper, which you can hear perhaps a little better. Thank you all for attending this excursion in the sonnet. Thank you to those of you who've come back from previous iterations of courses on poetry, and a preliminary but inevitable apology to the various members of this audience who've heard me before, because there will be inevitably a certain amount of recapitulation. I'm going to say things about sonnets that I've used to say things about other poems before, and in fact, in one or two cases, I'm looking at sonnets which we've looked at under different descriptions when I did a course on, for example, poetry and the sacred and so on and so forth. So there is going to be recap, and that's just the way it is in the nature of things. I will, however, be coming at things consistently differently through the course of the week or whatever. And the reason for that is that I'm talking about a particular form of English and other languages poetry, the sonnet. There are various forms in all languages. If you go to Japanese, you'll find the haiku and so on and so forth. And we could, in English, equally easily run a course on the villanelle or on the sestina or on the ballad would make an excellent course and so on and so forth. So there are various other particular forms, okay, which attend the canon of, in our case, English literature. But it's the sonnet which overwhelmingly interests me and seems to have interested enough of you to come and attend this particular class. Perhaps because the sonnet is the best known, or more deeply put, because there is some reason why the sonnet is the best known of the forms, and I want to attend to that particular problem as much as I want to attend to the particular sonnets that we'll be looking at and the particular social and political and generic circumstances of the evolution of the sonnet as it goes through time. To me, and it's useful here to know that I have a very advanced physicist, for example, in the audience. To me, the sonnet is a Platonic form in the sense that it's like mathematics. It is to some extent, and I know this is a philosophical point, George, but to some extent it is out there and awaited discovery by language as a kind of inevitability of the circumstance of its being. If we were extant in a vacuum and all of a sudden language came into being, it would inevitably, in my argument, find its way ultimately into the form that is the sonnet. There is something about the sonnet which is sponge-like with regard to language or whatever, and absorbs it, casts it into its particular form, okay, and gives it back to the world as we know it and read it and take it for granted. And it's going to be exploring that kind of almost Platonic inevitability, that prefiguration of the sonnet, its fingerprint, okay, its architecture, as it were, predicted, as it were, as an inevitable outcome of the fact of language, okay, which is me now leaning away from the physical towards the metaphysical, which I'm allowed to do because I lecture English, not physics, and I'm allowed to be a bit kind of magical and strange at times, which is going to be the kind of sub-theme or the undergirding and underwriting of what it is that I want to say over the course of the next 5 days or so. That's absolutely fine. The only thing is, have you managed to get an outline? The handouts may be in thin. Can you huddle up to somebody or whatever so that you can read a handout if one becomes available? Because I don't have you got one near enough to you? Because you'll need one as we go along. I can pull them up on the computer as well, but then the problem with these is that once they're on the board, I can't get to the board, which is underneath it's just part of UCT's incredibly perceptive design. You can either use the electronics or you can use the blackboard, but you can't use both, and I prefer to use the blackboard for a variety of reasons. There is a history to the sonnet, a kind of lost in the mists of time sort of history, somewhat speculative, undergoing revision all the time. It interests relatively few people. It's more or less accepted that the sonnet emerges first in the canons of Western literature as a song form in Sicily, down in the south at the football at the toe of Italy. And now revisionist stylistic scholars are attributing to the evolution of the sonnet considerable cross-pollination with the Hellenistic world of Greece, and more interestingly, considerable cross-pollination with the poetic traditions, the song traditions, the folkloric and folk song traditions of North Africa, okay, with which Sicily is, of course, closely physically associated, and with which, of course, Sicily and Italy are closely politically and historically associated. That sounds a little bit like bending over backwards to meet the decolonial moment, but I've no reason to doubt it, okay? I think it's highly likely that in the crucible that is Sicily, which is a far more Greek island than it is an Italian island anyway, in all kinds of ways, it is extremely likely, okay, that washing through, okay, the significant cities of Messina and whatever they're called or whatever should come these various echoes from different cultures at different times or whatever, and adduce to the creature that is known as the sonnet today. But at some stage during the early part of the Renaissance, the sonnet migrates or erupts, we should say, whatever, into the poetry of particularly the figure of Dante, okay, where it is used conventionally to apostrophize a Madonna-like figure in the celebration of the virtues of the Queen of Heaven. Okay, and it becomes an important moment in the trajectory of the sonnet because the next person it jumps across to in the story of its history, so far as we know it, whatever, is the very important figure of Petrarch. Okay, and it's in the hands of Petrarch that the sonnet begins to undergo its secularization. Petrarch, instead of devoting the sonnet to the hagiography of the Virgin Mary as the Queen of Heaven, starts using the sonnet to address not the Madonna, but a Donna, okay? A woman who usually embodies all the virtues of chastity and so on and so forth, all the illuminated grace and so on, that was once capitulated in the figure of the Madonna, okay, but now stands for something of a degree of secular interest. And that secular interest, okay, in the very, let's get it quite clear from the start, patriarchal positioning of the sonnet to begin with, as a male, okay, vocalization of masculine interests, okay, in a certain kind of womanhood, chaste, virtuous, the Queen of Heaven, and so on and so forth, whatever, becomes part and parcel of the sonnet's history in a very profound way. We will see by the time we get to Friday that the sonnet can end up being about anything. In fact, we will see that tomorrow already, that the sonnet departs quite early, even during the course of the English Renaissance, away from, okay, this hagiographic apostrophization of the unrequited beloved or whatever, which is the circumstance that Petrarch has in his sonnets, which worship the character of the plastic historical character of the woman that he calls Laura in the Italian or whatever. And the sonnet begins to move and change. Okay, and to some extent you know this already because it's likely that the sonnets that you've encountered way back in your schooling were likely to be those of William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare, of course, produces a sonnet sequence of, I can't remember how many it is, 187 or something sonnets or whatever, which are very peculiar. Some of them seem to be addressed in a very beloving fashion towards a young man. Some of them seem to be addressed to a famous dark lady, okay, who doesn't seem to embody any of the virtues strictly meant to accord with the passive recipient or objective of the sonnet as it's first construed or whatever in the hands of Petrarch and so on and so forth. So from quite early on, the English speaker going to an English medium school, encountering their first sonnet, okay, encounters something like what we're going to look at tomorrow. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration seeks, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is a never fixed mark, and so on and so on. And you have some sense of that. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red, and so you have probably bumped into those kinds of sonnets in your reading, or in films, or in other forms of exposure to media down the line. And you'll already have gathered from that the sonnet ain't as straightforward as it turns out to be. Okay, it is in fact a many splendid form and is capable of talking about a lot more than romantic love. But I think it's tremendously important that we understand that the sonnet's initial explosion, okay, into the European Renaissance as the absolutely dominant poetic form of that particular moment is constructed around the reverence brought to bear upon an unrequited love and the beloved object of that unrequited love in such a way as to sing the praises of women in accordance with virtues ascribed to womanhood, not by women, but by men, okay? And frequently to gently, but not so gently, accuse women, okay, of an uninterest in that particular man, according to errors on the part of that woman in reading the right codes as to what constitutes a perfected masculinity during the course of the Renaissance, and so on and so forth. So the sonnet begins very definitely, very locatedly, as we shall see, okay, as part and parcel of the panoply of culture and ideology attending male, masculine kinds of self-interest within a patriarchal society. It's important that we bear that in mind, because we're going to see sonnets that try to overturn that or play with it one way or the other as we go along. And we'll see today two sonnets or whatever, which are very much firmly established in that particular register and repertoire. Now, we might have little time looking at the sonnets today because there's a certain amount of preliminary material that we've got to get through. I often say to my students, come on, guys, how would you know a sonnet if you were walking down a dark street at night and one was coming towards you, okay? Would you know it was a sonnet? Would you know it was a villanelle? Would you know it was a haiku? Would you know it was a sestina? What would you know? And everybody says they would know it was a sonnet, okay? People have a strong sense of the form of the sonnet, this Platonic mystery that I am inclining you towards thinking of it as. People know things about the sonnet, okay? So even in my first year classes, whatever, I say, tell me about the sonnet, and a hand will go up and it'll say iambic pentameter. And often enough, that's the only instance in which that particular student has encountered iambic pentameter, despite the fact that 95% of English poetry is written in iambic pentameter. People will say things like 14 lines, okay, with great assuredness, whatever. And they're absolutely right, okay, until George Meredith comes along in the 19th century and writes a wonderful set of sonnets that we're not looking at today, okay, called Modern Love, all of which have got 16 lines and do something very strange in consequence of that. But yes, 14 lines. Part of a sonnet's Platonic mystery has to do with the extraordinary nature of the number 14, okay? And I'm going to be trying to show you how the division of that number 14 into units of 4, 4, 4, and 2, or 8 and 6, generate a certain dynamic in the sonnet which conduces towards the sonnet's conjury, its sudden ability to unfold itself, okay? And that's going to require me taking an excursion in a little bit more of the scientific world or whatever. And luckily we have a geologist here, because I'm going to be talking about water in its solid state, okay? Water when it becomes a rock, okay? Where it does some rather strange and peculiar things. And we'll probably come to that tomorrow. We might come to that today as it goes on. We shall see. So yeah, it's got 14 lines. It's in iambic pentameter. It rhymes. okay? That comes as an important thing to my students because rhyme is so desperately uncool and old-fashioned and so on and so forth. But the conventional sonnet rhymes and it tends to rhyme in a very set pattern, A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, or A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, whatever their variations of these things, whatever. Some of my students then get themselves in a tangle and a twist or whatever as they try to disaggregate a Petrarchan sonnet from an English sonnet, okay? And when they address the English sonnet, they've got to disaggregate the Spenserian sonnet from the Shakespearean sonnet. I'm not going to bother us with that at all, okay? Of course, there are variations on this particular form, okay? Just as there are variations of motor cars, okay? But what we're here to do is understand how motor cars work, not how a Ford differs from a Suzuki on the outside, okay? Or a Suzuki from a Hyundai, or whatever the case may be. I'm not overly concerned with that, and I don't think that you should be either. It's very easy to Google, if you need to, what the difference between one or other of these sonnets is, okay, or who initiates them and so on and so forth. They do have different effects. I might remark on those as we go along. But sure, we're walking down the dark street and this thing comes towards us, okay, and it's got 14 arms, okay, it's speaking in rhymes and it kind of goes da-dum, 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 okay, and we say it's a sonnet, okay, blow me down, we know it when we see it. I want us to think a little bit differently about the thing that is a sonnet. It's very nearly, but not actually square. Okay, that's one of the strange things about George Meredith's modern love sonnets, whatever, where he uses 16 lines. Okay, that is a square form, okay, 4 by 4. Okay, in a very obvious kind of way. Okay, the sonnet looks square, feels square. It's kind of the shape of the palm of the hand. And I like that as an aide-memoire because the circumstance in which the sonnet arises is not in the first instance the print culture of Europe. It rapidly enters into that because the print culture of Europe dating from 1450, okay, is extant at the time of the sonnet and is coincident with it, and sonnets do get printed. Shakespeare's sonnets got printed and so on and so forth. But the first iteration of the sonnet in its life, overwhelmingly, from Petrarch through to his imitators in English, and the sonnets that we're going to look at today both owe heavy and, in the first instance, direct debts to Petrarch. They're virtually imitations of Italian sonnets that precede them. These creatures first began as texts that were circulated from hand to hand. Okay, so the fact that they're shaped like a hand, okay, or shaped like a pocket is a kind of a useful thing. It enables us to remember that the sonnet was once something that was, as it were, whipped out of a back pocket and passed to somebody else who would read it, pop it in their top pocket, and a little bit later pass it across to somebody else while they quietly dashed off another sonnet, okay, in response to the sonnet that had been seen before. Sonnets initially originated in the circumstances of what we call coterie circulation or coterie publication. Okay, they originated around the upper reaches of society, upper class, upper middle class circumstances, and are particularly prevalent in the courtly life, okay, broadly constituted, okay, so not just the people immediately surrounding the king and the queen, okay, but also the lawyers, okay, at the inns of court and so on and so forth, that are part of the apparatus of, and I've now migrated away from Petrarch or whatever, and I'm concerning myself with the sonnet in English or whatever, are part of the stations of power in London. And it's in that part of the world, okay, that the first sonnets we're going to look at are moving. We need to think of them, okay, as something between a love note, something that fits in a pocket, something between a love note and perhaps a banknote, carrying the valency and value of power, okay, that is enshrined in cash. Can anybody remember cash? It's gone. We used to have these things called banknotes. Do you remember? You could exchange them or whatever for ice creams and so on and so forth before you waved your phone around and so on and so forth. Oh, it's no surprise, okay, to my mind either, that a phone looks much the same shape as a sonnet as well. And of course, the reason a phone is the shape that it is, okay, is the same reason that this page is the shape that it is, okay? And the reason that this page is the shape that it is and not square, okay, is because if you cut a cow up and have its skin hanging down, and you cut off the little bits of the arms and the legs, what you will get ultimately is this exact shape, okay? And that exact shape, okay, is far too big in the case of a cow to be written on, so it gets folded, and then folded again, and folded again, and so on and so forth, which is why Shakespeare's plays occur in volumes that are called either the quarto volumes that have been folded 4 times or the octavo volumes that have been folded 8 times or whatever. But there's a great deal of our material culture, okay, when it comes to the literate and the literary, which is in fact simply an accident of form deriving from the shape of a cow, because cow skin provided the vellum or parchment, okay, on which the earliest iterations of written forms arose. And it seems to me, once again, not an accident that the sonnet should recapitulate something of that particular shape, okay? It's again a clue towards the way in which I suggested the sonnet was absorbent, platonically absorbent, in anticipating the language that eventually fills it up and utilizes it. There are other things about the sonnet, special things, okay? In particular, this creature called the volta, the sudden turn that the sonnet produces in its argumentation, which I'm going to come to tomorrow, I think, and the day after, although we'll have a look at them in the sonnets we've got in front of us today. There is about sonnets, all sonnets, whether you want them or you don't want them, okay? And I often tell my students to go away and write a sonnet and to feel it happen. There's something in a sonnet, in its platonic anticipation of what language is going to do when it conforms to the particular patterns of a sonnet, which conduces towards the sudden estrangement of the argument and a 180-degree volte-face in the argumentation of that particular sonnet to produce a sudden and unexpected kind of conclusion, okay? It's part of the charm of the sonnet. It's part, because it's of the charm of the sonnet, of the endurance of the sonnet. One of the reasons why the sonnet has gone on and on being as useful as it is, okay? And I've got certain theories as to why the volta comes about, okay? And I'll talk to you about those more when we get onto some sonnets with serious voltas. We might do some of that today or whatever as we go through. Now, I'm afraid I've got this rather small handout, so being of my generation, the time has come to put on your spectacles as we begin to look through these kinds of creatures, noting all the while, okay, that we are dealing fundamentally with poems that were circulated in the coteries of power by hand in a handy kind of format, okay, not dissimilar, okay, in some senses to banknotes in the way that they transmit power in the political economy, as they transmit information about who is seeking alliances with whom else, okay, across the gender divide in the form of the suit of marriage, but also just simply in the kind of panoply of courtesy that attends courtly circumstances in supplying compliments about the daughter of powerful people or whatever the case may be. The sonnet frequently does this job. The sonnet as it arose in Italy was characterized by a lot of what we in English studies call tropes, okay? There came to be certain stock circumstances, stock metaphors, stock situations that the sonnet recurred to in recapitulating the fortunes and misfortunes of the ardent lover and his unrequited love for the passive female beloved in the circumstance of the sonnet. Be that as it may, okay, what we are going to be looking at, okay, is a form which evolves and changes and covers various bases in various different ways. The first sonnet I want us to look at, okay, belongs to Thomas Wyatt. Okay, my handwriting at the top is not particularly conducive to reading, but he's easily understandable. And I've got a photograph, well, not a photograph, I have an image, one shouldn't call that there, okay, of Wyatt. It's the one that's usually accepted or whatever. This one down here, okay, is perhaps the preferred one in many ways or whatever. But there's Wyatt as best we know him or whatever from the circumstance. And many of you will be familiar with Wyatt because you're familiar with Hilary Mantel's kind of Wolf Hall trilogy or whatever the case may be. The idea of this Thomas Wyatt sonnet, okay, the thought that underlies it, the kind of circumstance of speculative attribution that scholars have clouded it with, is still useful to us. And it goes as follows, that Thomas Wyatt was himself a suitor of some success or not, we don't know, of the woman that would have been known to us were she alive today as Nan Bullen, okay, Anne Boleyn, as she is more fancily called, okay, and that this sonnet does exactly the job that we'd expect a coterie sonnet in the courts of the Tudor Renaissance to be doing. It is a sonnet which both worships the unrequited love, okay, that Thomas Wyatt has for this particular figure, Anne Boleyn, or pretends to that unrequited status or whatever, even as it addresses very specifically the circumstances of power surrounding this particular figure, Anne Boleyn, okay, and warns other suitors against her because, as we all know far better, okay, Anne Boleyn was, we shouldn't say the wife of Henry VIII whose head got chopped off, but rather the mother of Queen Elizabeth I, the most extraordinary monarch, okay, perhaps that the British ever threw up at all. But it's called Whoso Lists to Hunt, and it utilizes, once again, one of those standard stock situations or what we call tropes in English literary studies or whatever, which is the idea of the unrequited beloved as a wild animal that the lover, active and masculine, seeks to capture and tame, or worse still, by implication we bring in our feminist scholarship here, perhaps to kill and consume, okay, or whatever the case may be. That's how I'd ask my students to push against the circumstance. And it goes like this. It's called Whoso Lists to Hunt. It just takes its name from the first phrase. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest come behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who lists her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain, and graven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck about, Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. So, conspicuously, we've got the poet saying he knows where a female deer is if anybody wants to hunt her. She's a pretty hot deer as deer go, and so on and so forth. But there are problems. Catching her is a bit like catching the wind in the net, okay? And let me put you out of all doubt, he says, there is another problem, okay? She has this diamond necklace around her neck, okay? And she has these words which Christ famously speaks to the disciples at the beginning of their encounter after the resurrection, do not touch me, okay? And as he says, The reason is, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold though I seem tame. There's a reference here to the herd of deer that one or other of the Caesars kept, or whatever, with diamond necklaces around them. But fundamentally, what we understand, the scholarship says, okay, although there is no smoking gun of proof in this particular fact, nonetheless, the circumstance conduces very heavily to this reading, or whatever. We've got Wyatt saying, watch out. You can chase this woman, but she belongs to the king. Okay, and as we all know, okay, from the history of Anne Boleyn subsequent to this particular sonnet, okay, the king is not somebody to be trifled with, okay? He is somebody quite capable of taking your head off very quickly. Okay, there it is. It's very obvious. It's a kind of a square-looking sonnet. It is more or less in an iambic pentameter. My first year, second year, even third year students would get themselves in a terrible tangle with the first line, because the first line, if you count it, has got 11 syllables in it, not 10, so you can't get iambic pentameter out of it. Whoso list to hunt, I know where is an oops hind. There comes the 11th one, or whatever. So that whoso has got to be kind of swallowed. That first who is kind of gulped down, or whatever. And then the sonnet trots off. Whoso list to hunt, I know where is an hind. And it settles down to the iambic pentameter and behaves quite normally, okay? But as for me, alas, I may no more, okay? And the sonnet rather boringly and metronomically, or whatever, seems to be adopting the iambic pentameter that my students could identify at 50 paces on a dark night in an alley in Italy. No trouble at all. But very immediately, whatever, we find ourselves in the hands of a poet rather than a mere poetaster. If we look at the third line of this particular sonnet, the vain travail hath wearied me so sore, okay? And we are to try and ask ourselves, where do you suspect I turn this? I know how to turn it off, but I want to know how to push the... Where do I lift the screen? Brilliant. Where was that? There, thank you. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. Okay, I just want to identify quickly for present purposes, and before I do that, yeah, can we pop the laptop off for now? That more or less recapitulates that particular line. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. Now, if we were to come along here and say, this is going to go, the vain travail hath wearied me so sore, okay, we could get away with it, but we would be slightly forcing, okay, the pronunciation of that particular line into this default ground, which is the iambic pentameter, okay, which is 4 iterations of a stressed followed by an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable that we call an iamb, okay, and is not necessary for you to know or remember in any way whatsoever. But really, when we read this particular line, we get the vain travail hath wearied me so sore, okay? We can read it with an enormous amount, okay, of stressed syllables littering the particular sonnet, okay? So somewhere between the default background, which is purable, the vain travail hath wearied me so sore, perfectly legitimate way of reading it, okay? Absolutely fine. We can see the sonnet, okay? We can see the language, as it were, being absorbed sponge-like into the Platonic anticipation of a Platonic form. And then we can also overread it and overhear it, okay, as it would be by somebody actually protesting their disappointment in love. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, okay? As the hurt or injured young man might in fact put it. And there's a very great distinction, okay, between this version on top with all the stress, okay, and the default version of the iambic pentameter below. The top line, okay, which is the line we overhear and correct, okay, the sonnet to read as human beings rather than as artificial intelligence might underneath things or whatever, is all in the project of the creature that those of you who've been in my classes will recognize from before, which we call mimesis, okay, and which has as its, in Afrikaans, stemwoord, okay, the notion of mime or acting out. The concatenation of stresses in that top line of meter or metered scansion, which is what we call the undertaking of the notation of meter. That particular top line scansion is mimetic of effort, weariness, and pain, all of which are drawn out circumstances. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. We can hear and even feel in the musculature of our throats the effort of vain travail. We can feel the ache in our throats, okay, of being wearied to the point of soreness. And we can feel, okay, once again, in the muscular armature of our throat, even if we don't say it aloud, by anticipation, okay, on our inner ears transference, okay, to our voice box in anticipation, because we're always doing this with silent language. We're quietly conforming it, okay, as spoken material in neurological impulses to our larynx, whatever. We can feel, okay, the accumulation of a so-sore situation, an aching that begins to, as it were, modulate itself in that particular form right then and right there. The point that I'm wanting to make about that in this circumstance is relatively simple, okay? The writing of a good sonnet, indeed the writing of a good poem, rests not on a blind conformity to the strictures of the form or genre that one's dealing with. The writing of a good sonnet or a good poem or a good novel or good drama for that matter, okay, rests ultimately on the way in which the author, his or herself, plays fast and loose with the technologies and default expectations of that particular form in such a way as to create a document that is produced not by the inevitabilities of artificial intelligence, okay, obeying a rote format, okay, as instructed by a programmer, but instead recapitulating the vicissitudes, the vain travails, the wearinesses, the so-sore experiences of the world, which human beings have and machines don't have, okay? Which the top line of my scansion of this particular line has, and which the bottom line, which is the default iambic pentameter, and which is perfectly permissible, okay, and is accurately there, containing the line, absorbing it and holding it in a platonic anticipation, okay, until it's overwritten or overheard, okay, by our straining ear. And in that particular moment, we move away, okay, from the dull, dross, and inevitable kind of can-do to the sonnets, okay, to the surprising and human dimensions of the poem, okay? And the thing becomes not a formula, okay? Not a message like my students would like to think it is, a vessel merely of content telling its particular story, but instead, okay, a machine for making us feel physically, I'm arguing, okay, what it is the poem is trying to say. So how the poem is written, okay, how the poem is conduced or conduces towards our pronouncing it, okay, becomes that element in the poem that we call artistry, okay, and we can let go, okay, of what the poem is fundamentally all about. What I'm saying, in other words, to my first year class is forget all this story of Anne Boleyn and the politics of this poem and all that kind of stuff. It's really important to understand because that is the context in which the sonnet arises, in coterie circulation, in courtly circumstances, okay? And Thomas Wyatt is conspicuously talking about a very hot item in the case of Anne Boleyn. Considerable power and transfer and transmission of power, okay, is concentrated in this particular individual, and that is what scholars presume the poem to be about. It very well and very accurately sums up the way in which these kinds of texts called sonnets were moved around, okay, to impart vital information about who was after who and why, okay, and who was hot in political terms and who was not, and so on and so forth. But what reaches through to us down 500 years, okay, is not a particular concern with the vicissitudes of power in the Tudor court of Henry VIII. What reaches down to us, okay, is instead the way in which the poetry of the poem doesn't just tell us the content of the text at hand, but makes us feel, word for word, travail for weariness, for soreness, or whatever, what that kind of experience is all about. So that we get to the end of this line, okay, and our larynx, whether we've used it actively by reading aloud, okay, or whether we've neurologically fired impulses into it, okay, by reading silently, but nonetheless engaging the armature of our vocalization, okay, enacts the weariness and the soreness and the achy muscled nature, okay, of romantic love. It's as simple as that. And so long as you get that principle, you understand fundamentally what a poem is about. There are lots of wonderful things in this particular poem that speak to its condition as good poetry. Perhaps the simplest of them, okay, one that embodies very nicely for a variety of purposes the kind of level of interest that I would expect from my students would be, for example, the alliteration. There's an idea that you get quite early on in your schooling, and most students would manage to do it. If we go on down to line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, draw from the deer, duh, duh. Okay, we got the double D's or whatever, setting up an anticipation, whatever. But as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow, I leave off therefore, okay? We get the sudden concatenation of fricatives, voiced and unvoiced in the case of F's and V's, okay? And of course, what these do is once again an instance of mimesis. They are merely mimetic of what it must sound like, okay, to catch the wind in a net or to chase after this deer through the bracken at the edge of the woodland. Okay, so the poem is laying down, okay, a subliminal soundtrack which tells us not merely what is going on, but gives us a somatic apprehension of how what is going on, okay, and elevates the text from the commonalities and commonplacenesses of prose into the creature that we call poetry. It's a wonderful poem for a variety of reasons. I love the little line, or whatever, a little bit beyond that. Fainting I follow, I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. Whoso list her hunt, I put him out of doubt. As well as I may spend his time in vain, and so on and so forth. That cuts both ways. I put him out of doubt. There are two informations that seem to be present in that particular possibility. Okay, there are two informations. On the one hand, I put him out of doubt or whatever. I'm interested in her, so don't come after her or whatever. But then, as it turns out, Caesar's she is, and wild for to hold, though she seem tame. Okay, so there seem to be two kind of ultimately possible solutions there. And if I were put up against a wall with somebody with a gun to my head and asked, where is the Volta, where is the turn, which I'm going to come to in subsequent lectures, okay, because it's much the most interesting aspect of sonnets or whatever, I think I might put it there. I put him out of doubt, because on that word doubt, okay, the whole artifice of certainty, the whole panoply of organized sonic information, which language is, and which is constituted in this instance in the template of the sonnet, is suddenly cast into doubt. Okay, we cannot read on or read retrospectively the material that's gone before without carrying with us, okay, this invocation of doubt. It's been spelt out for us in no uncertain terms. Okay, and then we can start playing games, which I would with my students, about what that word doubt rhymes with. It's doubt about. Okay, and the question becomes, how does the telegram work? What is the doubt about? And so on and so forth. And so we begin to unlock what the poem is more profoundly or more deeply about. Okay? And we discover that what the poem is about is doubt. The dubiety of romantic love. The fact that you can never know for sure that the person you're chasing who says they like you really likes you as much as you like them. Okay, that you can never know for sure, okay, that the girl with whom you made eyes at the bookshop launch or whatever all day long or whatever isn't in fact involved with somebody else who's Henry VIII and going to chop your head off, whatever the case may be. All of a sudden, the factor of doubt in human relations becomes the central, as it were, thematic of this particular poem. Philip Sidney was the beau ideal of the kind of Renaissance knight of his time. He was handsome, he played great tennis, he hunted well, he could dash off a sonnet and so on and so forth. He fought in the wars, he went over to Holland and foolishly got himself shot in the leg, okay, which would not bother us too much today, but of course in the days before antibiotics, okay, just as in the First World War, that was as good a death sentence as a shot through the heart. And he died ridiculously young or whatever in a silly war between the English and the Dutch in the Netherlands at that time. He seems, he's a generation after Wyatt, he seems at some point to have incurred the displeasure of Queen Elizabeth, who sent him away from court, told him to get lost for a little bit and so on and so forth. But he produced a marvelous sequence of sonnets and introduces into English, okay, something that is also absolutely coextant with the sonnet as a form, okay, and it's the fact that sonnets frequently occur in sequences. Philip Sidney's sequence is called Astrophil and Stella. Okay, those of you with your Latin and Greek will know very quickly that astrophil, whatever, is a star lover, and Stella is a star again, okay? Although a peculiar shift has happened since Kiana, who knows these various languages, will know that Stella was initially in Roman times a masculine name. It's become a female name subsequently. But Astrophil and Stella, whatever, follows the constant, beseeching, ardent, anguished, unrequited love for the star lover, Astrophil or whatever, for the beloved object Stella. And this is perhaps the most famous poem from that particular sequence. With how sad steps, O moon, thou climb'st the skies, how silently and with how wan a face. What? May it be that even in heavenly place that busy archer his sharp arrows tries? Sure, if that long with love acquainted eyes can judge of love, thou feel'st a lover's case. I read it in thy looks, thy languished grace. To me that feel the like, thy state descries. Then even of fellowship, O moon, tell me, is constant love deemed there but want of wit? Are beauties there as proud as here they be? Do they above love to be loved, and yet those lovers scorn whom that love doth possess? Do they call virtue their ungratefulness? You should almost invert to understand that last line or whatever. There's a gloss. Do the ladies there give the name of virtue to their ungratefulness or whatever? Do they call ungrateful there what we call virtue here? Once again, there's so much that we can talk about in this particular poem. Let's see if I can... Doesn't matter. You can look up Philip Sidney online to see what he looked like, whatever. We don't have a very good image of him as things go. But let's start looking once again mimetically at with how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies, okay? We can go, with how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies. With how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies. One can force it quite contentedly, thank you, dear, into iambic pentameter, okay? And make it obedient to the Platonic form as it exists. But that's not, of course, how we would really read it. We'd read it much more something like this, with how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies, whatever. And we would find once again, okay, a great agglomeration of stresses, okay, in the protestation, okay, that seems to be the more human pronunciation and the less mechanical pronunciation of this particular poem. The point of this, once again, is that we are dealing with mimesis. Okay, the poet is supposedly, okay, the speaker of the poem, the vocalizer, whatever, is supposedly looking up at the moon as it rises in the sky and saying, with what enormously sad steps you seem to climb the sky, so slow and agonizingly, okay? Okay, you seem so cast down or whatever. Are you also bummed out and dumped in love? That's his fundamental argument, okay? Okay, is it like that up in heaven? Even up in heaven does Cupid, you know, shoot you and stuff and make you suffer love and all this kind of goings on, whatever. The point being that in very simple terms, okay, the accumulation of stressed syllables, okay, is mimetic on the one hand of the slow, enormous undertaking, okay, of the moon's climbing the sky, okay, this enormous ball of rock, okay, that seems, okay, to us on Earth or whatever, to be doing this kind of immense act of lifting itself up away from the Earth at which it is contiguous at moonrise or whatever, and lumbering against what appears to be Earth's gravity or whatever into the sky. Of course, it's nothing like that at all, but that's the ocular apprehension of things. So too, this accumulation of stressed syllables suggests quite simply at a mimetic level that the lover, okay, talking about how sad it is to be a lover who's being ditched in love, okay, is under stress, is sad, okay? Everything is sore and drawn out and such an effort. And I had to get up and make breakfast, and all I wanted to do was stay in bed because she doesn't love me, she doesn't love me, she doesn't love me. That sense, okay, of the kind of merciless effort imposed on the unrequited lover, okay, is carried forth, okay, by the way in which the poem constitutes itself in these particular instances. With how sad steps, O moon, thou climbs the skies. But it's a bit strange. And this is where we find English poetry beginning to kind of turn, okay? Turn and turn away. And I'm going to say something here which may infuriate people if they have Italian heritage in this particular audience, whatever. The strange truth is, and I have enough Italian to be able to say it, that the sonnet is far better in English than it is in its originating Italian. The sonnet manages in English, okay, in a way that it never manages or managed in Italian, to escape the bounds of the predictive iambic pentameter, the predictive tropes, and so on and so forth, and surprise us with turns that are always making us, as part of the tradition, having to accommodate to newnesses and strangenesses, which we'll see in the next 8 sonnets that we're going to be looking at over the course of time. The strange thing in this sonnet, and this is where I'll conclude and take a few questions if there's time afterwards. The strange thing in this sonnet, okay, is that the poet is addressing the moon as though the moon, like him, is a man suffering an unrequited love. But the stock trope of the moon in the Italian tradition, handed down to the English tradition and other traditions, the French and so on and so forth, okay, of the sonnet, is that the moon is in fact the muse and is a woman, and causes men to go doulali, or lunatic, to use the term that takes the French la lune and makes it the stem word of that circumstance. So that we are left in circumstances over and over again in Western culture, when you get caught between the moon and New York City, or when you find yourself moonstruck, okay? Or you think of your teenage son or whatever, and you say to your husband or wife or whatever, Tom's all moony about that girl now, or whatever. When we say those things, we are recurring to an ancient predilection in the tradition of the sonnet, which has feminized the moon and ascribed to the moon as the white goddess, Brigitta in the Celtic tradition, as Graves uncovered for us, a prerogative in inspiring in men the affect of love, and in poets the need to goddamn write about it. Okay? So right from the outset here, Philip Sidney overturns an entire history almost just begun, okay, of the moon as a female figure. Okay, and here confounds us by addressing the moon as an unlucky in love male. So the reader of this particular poem, coming to it, habituated by an expectation of the moon as the muse, as that which brings the love and brings the poetry, suddenly finds this poem turned on its head, okay? Just as at the end of the poem, okay, the lover declares himself finding himself in a circumstance in which the whole nature and act of love is turned on its head, and his virtue has suddenly become an ungratefulness or whatever. When he loves somebody, he finds that instead of inspiring love, it inspires scorn, and so on and so forth. The tradition exists. It is applied to, it is present, but it is overturned in a way that is going to, as we will see in subsequent poems in this particular series, okay, going to expand exponentially the potential of the sonnet to talk about extraordinary things. So in a certain sense, to anticipate tomorrow when I want to talk about the Volta, okay, the turn in this particular poem comes right at the beginning. With how sad steps, O moon, thou climbst the skies, okay? We set out habituatedly believing that this is going to be an address by the unrequited lover to the muse that's caused him all the trouble of falling in love with this woman who won't return it, and so on and so forth. And then within a line or two, we discover, no, not at all. Okay, this isn't the white goddess inspiring the love. This is a fellow lover, and the moon is a masculine principle, okay? Struggling up in the skies at having been rejected by a lover down on earth, okay? In the hands of the English, okay? The tradition of the sonnet that the Italians gave to Wyatt, who traveled in Italy and brought the sonnet back, translated it, and used it directly into the English, whatever, is strangled like a babe in its cradle and turned into something completely different, okay? And we'll be seeing that in subsequent lectures. Okay, are there any questions at this stage? We'll learn much more about the prosody, that's the craft of the sonnet, as we go along, okay? We're going to learn more about the history of the sonnet as we go along. And we have the most exciting part of it all, which is the volta. Okay, where do sonnets turn? Why do they turn? And what is the kind of point of their turning? That comes further down in this series. Any thoughts, queries, or questions? Yes. We'll see sonnets that do take a title from tomorrow or whatever. But initially, okay, there are two reasons there.